Fundamentally Loathsome, Episode 3 is now completely fully written. And so I will get to shooting it soon. And, it actually very well might come out before the end of the year. I thought that I was going to get delayed and it wouldn't come out before the end of the year, but at this point it's actually looking like it might happen. So that's good. Anyway, June the King recently, I think yesterday, put out a video about the Amazing Atheist. And it wasn't a great video, but it was good. I think it's probably the best of these Amazing Atheist documentaries that people have made so far. I think they all tend to kind of suffer from similar problems. His video wasn't particularly interesting, and he didn't really have a lot to say about TJ, and it seemed like the video was actually much more just trying to be objective and tell an objective story, and so it just kind of glanced at these different events in his career without really saying much about them, except for the one that wasn't a glance. It was like a full-on expose, was the whole fake Sagan with the gun on Blog TV incident. I don't know why he put so much time into that, because it really wasn't that interesting. I mean, you can kind of get the gist of it. Fake Sagan is an unstable idiot who should never have been drinking with a gun. And he pointed a gun at TJ, you know. But, yeah, even though I don't think the video was particularly interesting, I do think it was probably the best of these that we've had so far, because I think, because it didn't try to attack the Amazing Atheist, it just sort of portrayed, you know, what happened. But it inspired me to make this video, because I've been seeing, you know, he's becoming this sort of part of the rotation, I would say, among these creators who like talking about other internet personalities, lolcows, and so on. He's just kind of another name that's now in the standard hat that they all pick names out of. So every week it's like, who am I going to make a video about this month? Or this, you know, fortnight? Oh, to Roja Lee Kincaid, you know. So, that's kind of where he's at now, I think, in terms of his notoriety. And so as long as he has that sort of notoriety right now, as long as people are interested in talking about him, I think I should probably explain him, maybe, for people who don't get it. Because probably the biggest problem with a lot of these videos made about the Amazing Atheist is that they all have this sort of straight culture assumption. And what I mean by straight culture is, you know, square culture. It's conformist culture. And so he gets made fun of a lot, and it's fair to make fun of him, but he gets made fun of a lot for being, like, weird. And a lot of people who talk about him are people who used to be fans of him and are no longer fans anymore. And they talk about it like, oh yeah, I was a fan back then when I was less mature. But then I matured, and because of that, logically, I'm no longer a fan. And I can see how stupid I was for being a fan of him back then. I think that this is an idiotic way to view the situation, because it implies that, like, it's somehow immature to be weird, to be different, to not be like everybody else, to not behave yourself like everybody else. And there's a little bit more to it than that. There's also, you know, the political takes and such. But I think a lot of these people kind of fail to take into account just how much TJ has taken into account his own failings in regards to his opinions. And there's this sort of assumption that the Amazing Atheist, yeah, he's just kind of stayed the same for his whole career. When if you look at it, I think that he has clearly made an effort to modulate himself and his behavior and opinions, not with a mind for being more mature, but with a mind for just, you know, developing himself intellectually and not stagnating. So he started out as a libertarian, and then he changed his mind on that and became a liberal, which he still is to this day. Even though TJ has a lot of this kind of anarchist rhetoric that he always had, even going back to his libertarian days, he has this sort of anarchistic mentality, but I don't think really he's anything essentially different from a liberal when you get right down to it. And so that's one part of it. The other part, there's basically two other parts that make up the Amazing Atheist's opinions that people claim to have matured out of, I guess. One of them is atheism and anti-theism, and the other one is the whole anti-SJW thing. Anti-feminism, we could call it. So if we're not talking about him just being weird, if we're talking about his opinions, then when people say they matured out of being a fan of the Amazing Atheist, it could mean that they're no longer liberal, they're no longer anti-theists, or they're no longer anti-SJWs. I think it's frequently that third one. I think most of the people who say this kind of thing are liberal, so I think we can strike that first one off. As for the atheism and anti-theism, there seems to be a lot of resentment against TJ just for being very kind of rude about his atheism. But I don't really understand that, because when you look at the people he would mock and criticize and yell at on his YouTube channel, they were all, you know, almost invariably these stupid pseudo-intellectual idiots who are coming out with this smug bullshit that anybody in their right mind would be able to see through. And so, to me, I mean, I always just thought it was funny and cathartic that somebody was, you know, coming out with this sort of edgy, like, I am a loudmouth sort of anti-theism. And it's really not all that different from the sort of thing that Hitchens or Dawkins would do. He just maybe did it with a little bit more flair. So I don't really know what people mean when if they're implying that they matured out of being into atheist commentary. Like there's a whole wave of I would call it the third wave of YouTube atheism that came out after the atheists kind of switched to social politics. And these guys, like I think there's a guy called Genetically Modified Skeptic. I think there's a guy called Mr. Atheist. I know that there's a guy called Cosmic Skeptic who is now going by Alex O'Connor. And these people tend to be a lot more measured in their tone. But I don't think that the things they're saying are really any different than the arguments that TJ was making. I don't think they're really any more intelligent than the arguments that TJ was making. I just think TJ struck a different tone because he wanted to communicate how frustrating it was to see people who were just refusing to think before they talked. Or they were thinking in an effort to purposely obscure logic and reason for their own business. I think he found that very offensive, and I think I find that very offensive. And so I think it's totally valid to use harsh language when condemning that kind of behavior. I think it's bad behavior, and so I think it makes sense for people to be frustrated with it. I think there's a difference between doing that sort of thing in a response video where you're making entertainment out of it, and doing that when you are just talking to someone face to face. And you'll notice when TJ would do actual conversations with religious people about religion, usually I think he made, you know, less of an effort of just dunking on them to be entertaining and more of an effort in trying to actually facilitate a communication. You'd see that on Drunken Peasants with, for instance, you know, like Vigilant Christian Mario. Now, Paul's ego ended up driving him off of that show because he was not taking conversation seriously. But I think when you look at how TJ was behaving, he was actually generally trying to have a real conversation, even if he wasn't maybe as you know, as perfectly polite as someone else with a little bit more professionalism. And so I don't really think it makes sense to say that you grew out of edgy atheism, because, I mean, what does that even mean? You grew out of being frustrated by stupidity? Well, good for you. You grew out of being entertained by people adding funny commentary to their criticisms? I mean, I just don't get why that's something to be proud of. You became boring, great. And then that third one, of course, the anti-SJW thing. I can actually see why people say they matured past that, because I do think it was a very immature analysis when TJ was doing it back then. Part of the problem is that they used the word feminism way too liberally, and they attacked this idea which they called feminism, but it was always a misnomer, because the truth is that, you know, feminism is quite a diverse set of principles and ideas, and it's not something that you can just monolithically attack unless you're some raging paleocon. And that's something that I think he understood even back then, but he was lazy, and he used this sort of shorthand because it was memeable and clickable, and it ended up kind of damaging the conversation. And he's been honest about that lately. He's talked about that lately and how he was wrong to do that, and I think he's correct in that analysis. And I think we were all kind of wrong back then in doing it in that way. However, I mean, this is, I think, important to realize, which is that the substance of TJ's criticisms against SJWs varied, I think, between grifting and not grifting. It's true that the Amazing Atheist was edging into being a grifter at that point in his career, because he was getting a lot of money, getting a lot of attention from doing that kind of content. And so when that happens, people who are money-oriented and attention-oriented will often try to capitalize on that by just pushing out more and more of what people want to see, what you're rewarded for seeing. And that is its own type of grifting, because he wasn't really interested in talking about this stuff after a certain point, but he kept doing it. Like, that whole year of 2016 was one of his best. In fact, it was his best year when it comes to numbers and popularity. But it was also his worst year, I think, when it comes to creativity, because he was doing stuff that he didn't want to do, that he didn't even really recognize much of a social need for, and it was because he was edging into that grift. And so this kind of opened up a sort of laziness in him that made him use these kind of half-baked analyses of certain arguments and stuff. Like, there's one time he recently, when I say recently, I mean in the last few years, he reviewed one of his old videos where he was talking about, like, some BuzzFeed video, and the issue of gentrification came up, and he had some kind of stock anti-SJW position on it in that video. But he when reviewing that video, in hindsight, he said, no, actually, I didn't know what I was talking about at all. I was just talking out of my ass here. I was just totally making this up. And that's the thing, is a lot of people got into that mindset where it was easy for them to just sort of say things that they didn't really mean, or they didn't really believe, because it was what they were expected to say. And they got a lot of positive attention for saying them. And so the whole grift idea, it's not as simple as, oh, I have made a decision to start lying for money. It's subtle. It's more subtle than that. It's a gradual descent into that kind of behavior, and we're lucky that he stopped himself before going too far. And I think that's because he does have integrity. But I think a lot of people aren't willing to acknowledge the fact that he has that integrity, or they just don't see it, they don't understand it, because they don't really understand him. But when it comes to his actual opinions about that stuff, when he wasn't just being lazy, when he was really speaking his truth, I think all that stuff generally still holds up. I think that the Amazing Atheist's commentary on the SJWs, the essence of it, what it was really about, was liberalism. He was a liberal who believed in free speech, free expression, and the ability for people to sort of enjoy things without having to kind of kowtow and placate to sensitive people. And that's something I firmly agree with to this day. And I think it was right. And you know what? Even I reviewed one of his videos from the time. It was called "The Questions White Men Have for SJWs." And in that video, I saw all these people in the comments being like, oh yeah, I remember I was so immature when I was into this. And oh, this video has not aged well in hindsight. And I watched it and I was expecting to feel the same way as they. But I didn't, actually. I saw that perhaps maybe 25% of the points in that video were stupid. And 25% of the points were sort of halfway stupid. But I thought the other 50% of the points were actually pretty spot on. And I think overall it wasn't a terrible video, it just wasn't great because there was a lot of lazy analysis back then that held that community back, and I think it came back to bite them in the end, because that community just ended up becoming the thing that created a space for the right wing to populate YouTube. And very few of the creators featured in that video actually became part of that right-wing bubble. I think the only one that really comes to mind is Sargon. Atheism is Unstoppable is kind of a gray area because he's never been right-wing, but he's still part of that bubble in a weird way because he's involved with Gavin McInnes and all that. So while I can understand why people would say they grew out of that and would criticize him for that period of his career, I think a lot of people don't really recognize the truth in his positions back then and how that truth still holds up, and the difference between what was true for him at the time and what he was just saying for money and attention. And so there's a nuance, I think, to his character that people don't really understand, they don't give him credit for. And these are ways in which he has improved with time. He has sort of ironed out these inefficiencies and deficiencies in his character, his presentation. And that's another thing that I don't think people give him enough credit for. I think the Cavernacle put it well enough when he said that he was surprised by how remarkably consistent TJ has been for his whole career. I think there is a thread of consistency that you can find for his whole career, but I also think there has been a lot of change. But why do I like The Amazing Atheist? You know, what brings me to really appreciating him the way I have for so many years? Well, I think what I love the most about him is the fact that he's weird, and he's proud of being weird. I like the fact that while other people are embarrassed about clowning around on camera, being naked, having their sex tapes leaked, talking about their degenerate minds, they like to cover up these things about themselves, these imperfections, these impurities. They like to pretend that they're these clean people. I like the fact that he has never made an effort to pretend, and he has always enjoyed being laughed at as much as being laughed with. That for him, the kind of attention he likes isn't just, oh, isn't this guy brilliant? It's also, isn't this guy a joke? He likes both of those things. And that's something that I really admire about him, and I've tried to sort of emulate in my own way with my YouTube channel, because I think there's a trap that people get into where they become too self-serious. And it's driven really out of insecurity that they want to be perceived as normal. But I think there's a great power in humility and in allowing yourself to be publicly humiliated and not allowing that to break your spirit. And that's why I think the way he handled the Bananagate incident was so perfect. And I think that's why he's gotten so much credit for that, is because people can see how much strength there was in that. There's a great human honesty to him. Even when he's not always honest, He's self-aware about that, and he points that out, and he's very clear about the fact that he isn't perfect, and he doesn't even seem to want to be perfect, which means that he's comfortable being what he is, and other people aren't. Everybody is always trying to be something they are not. And what's so refreshing about The Amazing Atheist is that he never seems to want to be something he isn't. Even when he has these sort of inflated senses of his own superiority, which I think is you know, maybe 65% of that is a joke. I don't think he actually is as narcissistic as he pretends to be. I think it's part of his humor that he's a narcissist, and he plays that up because it's one of those qualities he sees in himself, and instead of backing away from that and saying, no, that's a flaw, that's bad, I need to be less that, he leans into it because he recognizes that it's not even really that big of a problem. And when it's not really a problem, and when you have control over it, when you have enough control over it that you aren't going to let yourself get carried away with it and it lead you into bad territories in life, you can actually embrace it. And I think that's the distinction, is a lot of people mistake The Amazing Atheist for somebody who lacks that kind of control, who lacks the ability, the self-awareness, and the ability to sort of reckon with his flaws. But I think, no, it's the exact opposite. I think the reason he advertises these flaws so much is because he has enough awareness to have full control over them. And when it matters, when it really matters, I think he can step out of that persona and be genuine. But the thing is, it doesn't usually matter all that much. He's a performative person. He loves to perform. He loves to be, I mean, his name, The Amazing Atheist, it's supposed to be like a magician name. And I think that's always what he's been. He's been this showman who loves having a persona and being a character, not in the literal sense of being a fictional character, but in the colloquial sense of he's a character. That's what he is. And that creates this kind of larger-than-life personality that I think we all love. We all love people who are not just normal people. We tend to like people who have a kind of larger-than-life quality, who have this kind of persona and are a character and have this sort of the same kind of energy as something like a fictional character from a comedy show or something like that. Like a really interesting character. I think that gives him his own kind of charisma. I also think he's clever and funny in a lot of respects. Like, I think his Idiots series, of which my favorite episode actually no longer exists, Babies Are Idiots. If anyone has access to that video, send it to me, please, because I don't think it's even been archived. But Babies Are Idiots, and the whole idiots, like children are idiots, teenagers are idiots. He went through all the age groups. Those are my favorite videos from him, because those are like George Carlin routines. I mean, they're so expertly written, they're so funny. They have so much truth to them, but also exaggeration where it matters to sell the point and really bring home how absurd everything is. And so that's the thing, there's this delicate nuanced balance between truth and exaggeration, and I think he nails it. I think The Amazing Atheist has exactly the right combination of those things to where he's not a lolcow, but he's also not a straight. He's somewhere in between. He's in between a straight and a lolcow, and that makes him hard to categorize, and I think people are afraid of things that are hard to categorize. And so that's why I've always found him so relentlessly magnetic and interesting. Even in some of the least interesting phases of his career, I'm always interested in what he's doing and what he's thinking. As the YouTube community has grown, TJ has sort of lost his relevance. For a long time, people just weren't really talking about him very much. But I'm glad to see that now, actually, paradoxically, YouTube has grown so much that he actually now has a place in it again. And his place is as this sort of legendary aspect of YouTube lore, YouTube history, something that people make history documentaries about. And I would, I would love to someday be a subject of one of those. I've made one of those myself about Cinemassacre. And I also made one about Alex Day. I've actually made a few of those. And so I actually feel a lot better about TJ's place now, because I always thought it was kind of tragic that he lost his relevance over time. But now I'm seeing the fact that he has sort of lost his relevance for that period has sort of incubated this interest in him again. It's like, remember that guy? Oh yeah, I forgot about him. So there's a nostalgia element coming into play now, and I think that's great. I think it's great that at least people are finally paying attention to him again. Because he's someone who deserves to be paid attention to. He's somebody who loves attention, but I also think that he's interesting enough, and his story is interesting enough and eventful enough that it's worth looking at. So he's always been, my favorite YouTuber and one of my biggest inspirations in life, and I think he always will be. And that's why I like The Amazing Atheist. This is VEDN Day 14. See you tomorrow for VEDN Day 15.